It was April 18th, 2014, and Ang Tshiri had no idea it would be the last day of his life. The 56-year-old father from Nepal woke up at 3 a.m. in his tent at Everest Base Camp, just like he had every morning for the past 13 years. He pulled on his climbing boots, strapped his headlamp to his forehead, and slung his pack over his shoulders. Ang was actually excited because after that day's work, he'd be one step closer to retirement. This was supposed to be his final season on the mountain. What Ang Tshiri didn't know was that 1,000 feet above him, 31 million pounds of ice had been slowly cracking for weeks. And in exactly 3 hours and 45 minutes, that ice was going to make him a feature of one of Everest's darkest moments. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly why what happened next sparked the first revolution in Mount Everest's history, and why it took an unthinkable tragedy to finally expose one of the most shocking examples of inequality you've ever heard. Welcome to the extreme edge. When you hear about someone conquering Everest, what comes to your mind? Probably some incredibly fit person in expensive gear pushing themselves to their absolute limits, right? Maybe you picture them standing on the summit with their arms raised in triumph, posting that perfect Instagram shot with the caption, "Dreams do come true." What you don't think of is the guy who woke up at 3 a.m. that morning to carry their oxygen tanks. Or the guy who spent weeks installing every single rope that kept them from falling to their death. Or the guy who literally saved their life when they started dying from altitude sickness at 26,000 feet. You don't think of the Sherpas. You see, the Sherpas are an ethnic group from Nepal who live in the mountains around Everest, and for the past 100 years, they've been doing all the most dangerous work on the mountain so climbers can achieve their dreams. I'm talking about carrying 80-pound loads of gear up a mountain that kills people just for breathing wrong. They're installing ropes in places where if you slip, you're falling thousands of feet to your death. For summit attempts, they literally carry extra oxygen tanks so that when foreign climbers' bodies start to shut down from altitude sickness, the Sherpas can save their lives. Now, as you can probably guess, this is an incredibly dangerous job. But if you ask any Sherpa what the absolute worst part of Everest is, they'll all give you the exact same answer: the Khumbu Icefall. Picture a frozen waterfall, but instead of water, it's made of house-sized blocks of ice that are constantly moving and shifting and collapsing. This ice waterfall moves about 3 to 4 feet every single day. So every morning, the Sherpas have to go out and rebuild the route through this death trap, because what was safe yesterday might be a 100-foot deep crevasse today. To cross this nightmare, they lash aluminum ladders together and lay them across crevasses that are so deep you literally cannot see the bottom. They anchor ropes to ice screws that could melt out and fail at any time. And they have to do this work in complete darkness at 4 a.m. because once the sun comes up and starts warming the ice, the whole thing becomes exponentially more dangerous. And here's the really messed up part. A paying customer who's climbing Everest might cross through this death trap 6 or 7 times total during their expedition, but a working Sherpa? He might cross it 30 or 40 times in a single season, carrying loads back and forth. That means a Sherpa is actually 5 times more likely to die in the icefall than the clients he's guiding, just because he's forced to risk it again and again so someone else can chase their summit dream. Now, for their efforts, you'd think these guys would be making bank, right? I mean, they're literally saving people's lives while risking their own in the most dangerous workplace on Earth. Well, while foreign climbers are paying around $90,000 for their Everest experience, for their permits and gear, the Sherpas who keep them alive earn about $4,000 for an entire expedition. $4,000 to cross a death trap 40 times while carrying someone else's gear. So the people taking the most risk are getting paid the least money. And on April 18th, 2014, that inequality was about to lead to something that had never happened before in the 100-year history of Mount Everest. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. Now, to understand what happened to Ang Tshiri that morning, you need to know about something called a serac. A serac forms when a glacier, which is basically a river of ice, flows over a cliff or sharp drop. Instead of flowing smoothly, the ice cracks and breaks apart, creating massive towers and chunks that hang off the mountain like broken teeth. And these aren't small pieces of ice. We're talking about formations that can be 30 stories tall, weighing millions of pounds, held in place by forces that even people who study glaciers don't fully understand. And they can collapse at any moment. No warning, no rumbling, no sign that anything's wrong. 1 second they're there, the next second they're not. Now, the serac hanging above the Khumbu Icefall had been growing for years, getting bigger and more unstable with each passing season. By 2014, this thing weighed 31 million pounds, roughly the weight of 15,000 cars stacked on top of each other, suspended off the side of Mount Everest. That in itself was a red flag, because remember, they can drop at any moment. Whether you're walking underneath them at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m., whether it's sunny or snowing, whether the mountain is quiet or shaking, seracs don't care. They follow their own timeline, and that timeline is completely unpredictable. And even worse, this particular serac was developing what climbers call hairline fractures. You know when you drop your phone and the screen gets those tiny spiderweb cracks that start small but spread over time? That's basically what was happening to this 31 million pound block of ice, except instead of your phone screen breaking and falling a few feet to the ground, this was a building-sized chunk of ice that would fall 1,000 feet onto anyone walking below it. So every single time a climber and guide passed through the Khumbu Icefall, they looked up at this massive serac with growing unease. You could literally see it getting worse each season. In fact, in 2012, Russell Bryce, one of Everest's experienced and respected expedition leaders, took one look at this serac and made a decision that shocked the entire mountaineering world. He canceled his entire season, just pulled the plug on millions of dollars worth of expeditions, and sent everyone home. His exact words were, "I am no longer prepared to take that risk. I'm very concerned that a major accident could happen if we carry on moving through the icefall." And this wasn't him being overly cautious. Russell, after all, had been running Everest expeditions for decades. He'd seen every kind of danger the mountain could throw at climbers. But in 2012, even his own Sherpas were scared. And these are guys who had been climbing Everest for decades, who had survived things that would kill most people. But when they looked at this serac, even they were telling Bryce that they didn't want to go under it. In fact, 3 of his most experienced head Sherpas actually came to him and expressed genuine concern about their safety. One of them literally broke down in tears, apologizing to the paying clients, but absolutely refusing to climb under that formation. Something about that scene made him so worried that he was willing to destroy his business reputation rather than put people underneath it. He knew what was coming. In fact, he publicly warned that he expected a catastrophic accident in the icefall. And remember, this was in 2012, 2 full years before our story takes place. Now, you must be wondering the same thing I did when I first began researching this incident. If one of the most experienced guides on Everest was so terrified of this serac that he canceled his entire season, and expert Sherpas chose to quit rather than climb, why did every other expedition company keep operating? The reason for that is depressingly simple. It's something anyone older than 12 has probably guessed. Money. See, the Nepali government collects $10,000 from every single climber just for the permit to attempt Everest. That's $10,000 just to try. If you're watching this in 2025 or later, that fee is now $15,000 per climber. But in 2012, they issued 325 permits. That's over $3 million flowing into the government's pockets before anyone even sets foot on the mountain. But that's just the beginning. Foreign climbers were paying expedition companies anywhere from $35,000 to $90,000 each for their shot at the summit. We're talking about people who've spent years training, years saving money, years dreaming about this one moment. For many of them, climbing Everest represents the culmination of everything they've worked toward their entire lives. And it's not just the climbers. Think about the entire ecosystem built around Everest. Expedition companies employing hundreds of guides and support staff, helicopter companies doing rescues and supply runs, hotels in Kathmandu, gear manufacturers, insurance companies. Everest climbing generates tens of millions of dollars every single year for Nepal's economy. To close it down would have been an economic disaster. So when Russell Bryce looked at that Sirach and said, "This is too dangerous," the rest of the industry looked at those millions of dollars and said, "We'll take our chances." And for 2 more years, expeditions kept operating underneath that death trap. They knew the clock was ticking. They knew that Sirach was getting more unstable every day. They knew that eventually physics would win and that massive chunk of ice would come crashing down. But they also knew that every day they could keep the mountain open meant more money flowing in. And in the end, the promise of profit proved stronger than the fear of death. There was simply too much money at stake to shut down the mountain based on what might happen. 2 years after Russell's warning, the Sirach was still hanging there, bigger and more fractured than ever. And at 3 a.m. on April 18, 2014, Ang Tshiri's alarm went off in his tent at Everest Base Camp. Now, most people waking up at 3 a.m. are miserable, groggy, cold, wishing they could stay in bed. But Ang Tshiri was different that morning. As he sat up in his sleeping bag and reached for his boots, there was something almost like excitement in his chest. Not because he was looking forward to walking through a death trap, but because he knew something that made all the danger worth it. This was one of the last times he'd ever have to do this. His wife was back in Thamo village right then, probably awake too, thinking about the restaurant they were going to run together. They were going to call it Camp 2, a tribute to all those years he'd spent cooking at that elevation on Everest. After 13 years of 3 a.m. wake-up calls and dancing with death in an ice maze, Ang could almost taste that normal, simple life. He pulled on the same worn climbing boots he'd probably been using for multiple expeditions and strapped on his headlamp, a simple LED light that was going to be the only thing keeping him from walking off a cliff over the next few hours. Outside his tent, base camp was coming alive in that quiet like it did every morning. No loud voices, just the soft crunch of boots on snow, the quiet zip of tent doors, the muffled clanking of gear being loaded into packs. Ang Tshiri shouldered his pack, 65 pounds of cooking gas canisters. In a few hours, the plan was to carry this load through the most dangerous section of Mount Everest so wealthy foreign climbers could have hot meals at 21,000 feet. Gas for their stoves, fuel for their comfort. He joined the line of headlamps moving toward the Icefall entrance. About 200 men, mostly Sherpas, walked in single file through the darkness. It looked almost peaceful from a distance, like a procession of fireflies floating through the night. In no time at all, the procession was at the entrance of the Khumbu Icefall, and Ang Tshiri stepped into the maze for what he didn't know would be the last time. The first thing that hit Ang Tshiri in the Icefall wasn't the cold or the darkness, it was the sound. Not silence, like you'd expect, but this constant, low groaning. The sound of millions of tons of ice slowly moving, grinding against itself, shifting in ways that could kill you without warning. But Ang Tshiri had done this routine hundreds of times before. The routine was simple. Clip your safety line to the first fixed rope and start moving forward. Step across the aluminum ladders. Don't look down at the void. At the end of the ladder, unclip and move to the next section. Clip, move, unclip, clip again. Except something felt different that morning. The ice was groaning louder than usual. Sharper sounds, like the mountain was straining against itself. And there was more debris than normal. Chunks of ice the size of refrigerators scattered across the route that hadn't been there yesterday. What Ang Tshiri couldn't see, what none of them could see in the darkness about 1,000 feet above, was that a massive tooth of that hanging Sirach on Everest's west shoulder was reaching its breaking point. Those chunks weren't random. They were pieces that had already started breaking away during the night. 5 minutes into the climb, as Ang Tshiri navigated around a fresh icefall, stepping carefully over blocks that could have crushed a car, those hairline fractures were spreading faster now. What had taken years to develop was accelerating in minutes. As he moved deeper into the icefall, the Sherpa ahead of him suddenly stopped and held up his hand. The entire line froze. In the sudden silence, they could all hear it. A deep rumbling from somewhere high above them. It lasted 10 seconds, then stopped. They waited, listened. Nothing. The line started moving again, but faster now. Everyone had the same instinct. Get through this section quickly. Something was wrong up there. They didn't know it, but the Sirach above had reached a critical fracture point. It could fall literally any second now. With each passing minute, more sounds echoed from above, not just groaning now, but sharp cracks, like gunshots echoing off the mountain walls. The other Sherpas were moving even faster, some of them almost jogging across the ladders despite their heavy packs. And at exactly 6:45 a.m., as Ang Tshiri reached for the next rope, it happened. First came a sound survivors would later describe as a deep tung, like a hammer hitting a muffled bell. Next, a crack that was so loud it felt like it came from inside your skull. Then, the roar, like every freight train in the world bearing down on you at once. But it was no man-made train. It was 31 million pounds of ice hurtling at deadly speeds towards unprepared, defenseless Sherpas. The avalanche hit like a concrete tsunami. Bodies didn't just get knocked down, they got erased. Swallowed under ice blocks the size of cars, buried under tons of debris moving faster than a highway collision. When the roar finally stopped and the massive cloud of ice and snow settled, something had happened that would change Mount Everest forever. 16 men were gone, just erased from existence in about 10 seconds. It was, and still remains, the deadliest day in Everest's history. The rescue operation that followed was absolutely heartbreaking. Helicopters swooped into the debris field, dangling bodies beneath them on long lines as they ferried the dead back to base camp. The injured were rushed to hospitals in Kathmandu. 13 bodies were recovered quickly. 3 remained buried so deep in the ice that they were never found. And one of the men they pulled from the ice was Ang Tshiri, the same guy who'd woken up hours earlier, happy he was almost done. Just a couple more weeks, a few more trips, and then he was finished with Everest for good. But when the avalanche stopped, Ang's journey really was over. No more early mornings, no more mountains. That dream he'd been saving for was gone, just like that. For the next 3 days after the avalanche, Everest was in chaos. The surviving Sherpas left to be with their families and mourn their dead. Expedition leaders canceled their climbs. The mountain went quiet. But here's where this story takes another wild turn. On April 21st, the Nepali government finally showed up to address the tragedy. And the response was so insulting, so tone-deaf, so completely outrageous that it sparked something that has never happened before in the entire history of Mount Everest. They announced they would provide 40,000 Nepali rupees to each family of the dead men. That was about $400 at the time. $400. Let me put this in perspective for you. Each foreign climber pays the Nepali government $10,000 just for the permit to attempt Everest. That season alone, 334 people bought permits, which means the government collected over $3.3 million in permit fees. But when 16 men die generating that revenue, their widows get $400 each to cover funeral costs. Now, here's why this is an insult on so many levels. In Nepal, a proper funeral costs about $1,000, which means the families couldn't even afford a basic farewell. So while the government pocketed millions, the people who actually risked everything got less than half of what it takes just to say goodbye. To put it another way, some foreign climbers spend more than $400 on a single piece of climbing equipment. But according to the Nepali government, that's what a Sherpa's life is worth. Nima Doma, whose husband Chiring Onchu died in the avalanche, summed up the impossible situation facing Sherpa families. What can you do when the main pillar of your house is not there? The children were small, and I was worried how I will educate them and how we will sustain ourselves. The government was essentially telling this widow and mother of 2 that her husband's life, a man who spent years risking everything so foreign tourists could achieve their dreams, was worth less than a decent pair of climbing boots. And that's when something extraordinary happened. For 3 straight days after the avalanche, the Sherpas held meeting after meeting. But these weren't your typical expedition briefings with foreign guides and government officials. No, these were Sherpas talking to Sherpas, dozens of them, speaking in their native language. And with each conversation, they were getting angrier and more unified. The foreign climbers and expedition leaders could only stand around base camp, watching these discussions unfold with growing unease. Because slowly, they were starting to realize something that should have been obvious all along. Their entire expedition, their entire ability to climb this mountain depended completely on Sherpa support. Without these men, they couldn't reach the summit. Without these men, they couldn't even survive a single trip through the Icefall. Something was building. something that had never happened before in the mountain's history, but nobody knew that. On April 22nd, the meetings at base camp had reached a conclusion that sent shockwaves around the country. Sherpa Tulsi Gurung, speaking for the assembled Sherpas, made an announcement that had never been made before in the 100-year history of Mount Everest climbing. We had a long meeting this afternoon, and we decided to stop our climbing this year to honor our fallen brothers. All Sherpas are united in this. For the first time in Mount Everest's history, the invisible workforce that made commercial climbing possible had gone on strike. They had shut down the entire mountain. And just like that, they did something that had literally never been done before in Mount Everest's century-long climbing history. They went on strike. They shut down the entire mountain, and the effect was immediate and absolutely devastating. Because 600 climbers had been at base camp before the avalanche, people who had spent years training for this moment, people who had paid tens of thousands of dollars, some had paid close to $100,000 for their shot at the summit. People for whom climbing Everest represented the culmination of everything they'd worked toward their entire lives. Suddenly, all of it became completely meaningless, because without Sherpa support, they were just wealthy tourists camping in a very dangerous, very expensive parking lot. The climbing companies started falling like dominoes. Adventure Consultants, one of the most established guiding companies on Everest, immediately announced they were canceling the rest of their season. International Mountain Guide, which employed over 100 Sherpas, also canceled their season. One by one, every major expedition on the mountain called it quits. By April 24th, only about 40 climbers remained at base camp out of the original 600. The Sherpas had brought the entire Everest industry to its knees, with nothing more than a collective no. And you know what? It was about time. Because here's what this strike revealed. The entire Everest climbing industry was built on a foundation of some of the most appalling inequality you can imagine. Get this. Since 1922, 130 Sherpas have died on Mount Everest. That's more than 1/3 of all deaths on the mountain. The people earning the least money and getting the least recognition were dying at rates that would immediately shut down any workplace in the developed world. And what were they dying for? So wealthy foreigners could post summit selfies on Instagram and brag to their friends about conquering Everest? The strike forced these uncomfortable truths into the open for the first time. Suddenly, international media was paying attention to the invisible workforce that made Everest climbing possible. Suddenly, people around the world were asking the hard questions. Why were Sherpas paid so little for taking so much risk? Why was their safety treated as expendable? The Nepali government, now facing massive international pressure and watching millions of dollars in climbing revenue evaporate, scrambled to respond. Within days, they announced major changes. Death benefits were increased from $400 to over $10,000. Insurance coverage was raised. They promised to establish relief funds and cover medical expenses, but it was too late to save the 2014 season. The Sherpas had spoken, and they didn't back down. The courage that Ang Tshiri and all these Sherpas showed in risking their lives every single day so that complete strangers can achieve their dreams is just incredible to me. And while what happened to them is absolutely heartbreaking, their sacrifice finally forced the world to see an injustice that had been hidden for nearly a century. Today, there's a memorial at Everest Base Camp with the names of all 130-plus Sherpas who have died on the mountain carved into stone. And when you look at those names, you're not seeing statistics. You're seeing fathers who worked the most dangerous job on earth to send their kids to school. Sons who supported entire villages with their earnings. Brothers who shared everything they had with their communities. Mount Everest is still dangerous. People still die every season. The Khumbu Icefall remains a death trap that has to be crossed. But when tragedies happen now, the world pays attention. The families of victims know their losses have meaning. So the next time you see someone celebrating on the summit of Mount Everest, just remember this. Behind that triumph is a Sherpa who made it possible. And remember April 18th, 2014, the day 16 men died and changed Mount Everest forever. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.